I'm Kevin Jacobsen of Gold Derby here with Jin Ha, one of the stars of Pachinko, which just wrapped up its first season on Apple TV Plus. So you play Solomon in this show, who he has this Korean heritage. He was raised in Japan, he was educated in English, and he's also this successful businessman. And I'm curious if you could maybe put into your own words, I guess, how you came to understand Solomon in the beginning on a deeper level and how he kind of became the person he was.
Hmm. Oh, that's a great question. I mean, that's the question, right? With every role. I think there were a lot of facets to it in terms of points of entry that I had with a character like Solomon. Um, the most obvious would be through the linguistic element of it, because for me, it was, I mean, the amount of work that I had looking forward to the entire shoot, the language component was by far the most challenging and just the most. And so um, I think I focused on trying to access parts of Solomon's life experience or character through the thread of language. And by that, I mean, because language is also cultural, because it's also um, a social and political as well, I was able to sort of, or not, I was able to, I focused on, for example, learning the Japanese. I had to learn Osaka dialect and the Kanto standardized Tokyo dialect as well. Because I imagined, or we imagined, my language coach Yumi and I, and also Sue Hugh, our showrunner, in conversations, we sort of landed on, let's make this as authentic as possible. If we're going to do this in the languages that would have been spoken and not some accented English to represent foreign languages, let's go all the way. And so with a character like Solomon, who is juggling so many different identities and so many different backgrounds within himself, it was important to me to try and get the dialects as accurate as possible, to have them have a distinction at all to begin with. Because that sort of code switching, I mean, even within English, we do this all the time, whether we're at work or at home or with friends, etc. Um, and so similarly, I wanted that life experience to come through in his language, even if people wouldn't notice it, even if a lot of the audiences don't speak Japanese or don't recognize the different dialects. I wanted that honesty to be there, not just for the demographic of the audiences who speak Japanese, but also just for the fact of like, uh, this is history. You know, this is a story that's bigger than myself that I'm getting to tell. I want to do it right, as bright as I can. And then through the language, it was also like, well, what kind of music was he listening to? I really like getting to a character through the music that they would have heard growing up. And so I imagined, like, okay, if he grew up in Osaka, I know the area that he grew up in, I know the schools that he attended. It's not brought up, but we just decided on international school in that area because his father suddenly had wealth through the pachinko business, and there was like, okay, there's opportunity here for education. And so I started with like enka music, which is like, I think the 50s maybe, which I was like, oh, maybe that's something I would have heard as Solomon, you know, that my grandparents or like my parents were playing as a kid. So then that would have been in the background, or like as I'm walking down the street, like maybe an antique store would be playing that. And then I sort of went into, you know, 70s and like um, Japanese city pop. I got really into, um, which for me was also like, oh, this is the musical context in which all of the world events and personal events of Solomon's would have been happening. And then 80s, funnily enough, transitioned me to America because that would have been about the time when late 70s and 80s would have been when he went to study and then eventually work in finance in New England. And that to me was easier, I suppose, because I was like, oh, it's just 80s music that I love already. And then even with the English, I brought it into so that it wouldn't sound like me today now. Um, One of my speech coaches from grad school and I came up with this sort of, we called it, what was it? New England privilege, I think was what we called it. It was sort of like this, the financier of the 80s in New York City, you know, having been educated in at Yale and Choate as well. What was the sound that he would have been emulating or assimilating to as he learned English? Um, and then with the Korean element, I copied my dialect coach Yumi's Japanese accented Korean because she also happened to be Zainichi Korean as well, or she happened to be Zainichi Korean and an actor. And so I used her template of her Japanese accented Korean for Solomon's because my Korean is a little bit has a little bit of an American accent. And but all of these technical details that I worked on really for me helped get into the specifics of who Solomon was in all of these different spaces. Whether that's, I mean, even the way we speak different languages, our mouth posturing, our oral posturing changes, and how we hold our lips, how we hold our, maybe our jaw or anything like that. Like, I do think there's an effect of language on those physical elements. And so I sort of just followed the thread of curiosity from the language component and then the music, and then obviously the clothes is a whole nother aspect. And yeah, that was it's, I mean, there's so much more, but that was a part of the process of how do I get into that. Oh, I just thought of something else too. And then separately, from a more emotional place, having been a Korean American immigrant myself, born and raised in, or born in Korea, raised in Hong Kong, and then eventually coming to Connecticut and Jersey and New York, the experiences that he would have felt of trying to fit in, of often being one of the few people of color, if not Asian people, in a social group or in an educational group or in a work group as well. Um, that that was something I understood deeply. And so for me, those elements, I didn't feel that much of a stretch because I was like, oh, I understand this entirely. It was the stuff that felt further away that I tried to put a lot more attention to.
Right. Well, I also wanted to just talk about maybe the dynamic on the set and just how differently maybe it felt for you from other projects that you've done in the past.
Oh God, so different in so many beautiful ways.
Mm.
Well, okay, so the difficult thing was that we were shooting during the pandemic, and so as I imagine every single production over the past 2 years and continuing have experienced is the challenge of how do we continue work safely and how do we make sure that everybody, including YJ, who was 70s in her 70s at the time of shooting, like how do we protect her? This was before the vaccination too. Um, so a lot of COVID protocols and testing and being careful and thank goodness for the COVID managers. So that was different. That was new, certainly. And then in another aspect, it was so um, it was really wonderful to be around to be shooting in Korea where I'm from and for the first time, and having a crew that was mostly Korean as well, and in Canada as well, obviously a cast that is predominantly Asian, if not Korean, and it's incredible. It came through in our preparation. I think it came through in our work because so many people from one of our executive producers to our showrunner and writer to both of our directors, and then to our cast to be Asian, to be of Asian descent, whether that's Asian American, Asian Canadian, from Korea, Zainichi, or Japanese. It gave us a shorthand of understanding of why we're here and what story we're telling and why the story is important to us, and why it's important for us to get it right and work together well. Um, it almost, thinking back, it doesn't even feel like most of the people that I got to work with often, like the 1989 timeline folks, it feels more just like, oh, I have now lifelong friends that I just didn't have before this job. Obviously, like that's a part of our work, is that like we sort of get together with this group of people, like a troupe of, theater troupe that's been touring. We get really close and then we all kind of explode into our own lives, and maybe we'll cross again in another job or some other context. But with this job, it felt so um, personally motivated, each and every one of us, to the fact that we were all here and gathered and getting to tell this family story. um, that feeling never went away the entire shoot.
Yeah, and I do think just from watching the show, you could feel that
Oh, good.
like a level of investment, I would say, in this
Yeah, that's a good way
material.
of putting it. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. The investment was always present. Yeah, I guess
Mm,
because sometimes, it's people are different places in different parts of their lives, and maybe there's less of an investment in whatever job it is. But with this
right.
one,
Hmm.
truly, we were all fully invested.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned YJ, the great Yunya Jung, Oscar winner, acting legend. You get to spend quite a bit of screen time with her. I'm just curious how much you were able to learn from her just in watching her process and, getting to go back and forth with her on so many scenes.
Yeah, the short answer is a lot.
Yeah.
I'm stoked for season 2 because I get to learn more. I get to watch more and witness more of her brilliance. I think it's a lesson that I remember trying to hold on to when I was in grad school at NYU, but to be able to see it in real life, someone just living the sort of ease, the easefulness is what I'm interested in. And who knows if it comes with age or comes with life experience or if it's just an innate knack, because I've also seen her in her earliest movies when she was like 20, 21, the Kim Gi-young films, and she's brilliant in that too. So I'm like, maybe some people just have that. But there is this um it's so simple. And I mean simple in like the highest order of like the work that it requires, or the confidence and craft it requires in order to get to a place of like, well, I'm just going to show up and be present on set. And when they roll camera, or when they say action, I'll say my lines, but it's still from the place that I'm at right now, because this is my most honest state, or this is my most honest self. And so I'm going to speak from there. And I don't know if that comes from like work before she steps onto set. We're in holding sometimes, but like, we're not always together offset in between takes. And it was I think there's a lack of preciousness with each take, I think, with YJ. And I really admire that because it allows for, I think, more freedom maybe, or more um, stillness. I mean, stillness in like not just a physical sense, but I mean a stillness in like sort of this emotional or even spiritual way of like. Uh, and then at the same time, now I'm starting to think though about like the character herself, and maybe that's her interpretation of like, who is this character after everything she's been through. We are now seeing her in her older state. How does she carry herself at this point? And I think that comes through in the gravitas that YJ has, or is bringing to this role. And it's interesting because I can learn a lot, but at the same time, like a lot of the things don't apply to Solomon as well, because there's such different characters and they're at such different places in their lives, not just age-wise, but I mean like the things that Solomon cares about, certainly at the beginning of the season, um, are completely contradictory to what Sunja is trying to sort of instill in him or remind him of. In the train station scene is sort of where I think they butt heads most directly. But yeah, it was really lovely. I'm this sole fact that I got to work with and get to know YJ was made this project beyond worth it.
Yeah, absolutely. I could feel that. I even spoke to her when Minari was happening, and
Oh
she's
yeah,
a delight.
yeah.
Yeah. But I think another interesting element to this story is, Solomon with Hana,
Mm.
who's, his ex-girlfriend who is now dying of AIDS. And it's the two of them just have such a rich history. But we're really seeing them here kind of at the end of their story. So in terms of working with, Mari Yamamoto on that relationship and just making that really beautiful final moment of him taking her outside the hospital and pretending it's Hawaii and all that, how did you develop that sense that these two people, they've known each other for a number of years now, like
Yeah,
that you feel that lived in relationship there?
completely. God, these are great questions. Because these are the exact questions that we're asking ourselves as the actors preparing the roles too. it reminds me of when I was working on devs with Sonoya Mizuno, and the whole premise of our relationship was we meet them years after they had had a relationship already that ended tumultuously. We don't see any of that, but that history needs to be present and palpable there. How do you do that? Similarly with Mari, it was the same sort of challenge of like, right, we are seeing them at the end. I hope we get to see more, of the earlier part moving forward, but the and even the earlier parts are played by different actors, which I went to set that day just to watch, so I could see like when he went to the police station. I was able, and I watched the dailies of when I wasn't able to be there physically, but I wanted to sort of imprint that memory in my mind to be like, this was me when I was a kid. This is my memory. When I think back on it, I can maybe reference this. But with Mari, because it was a pandemic and because we were in separate locations, um, sort of right up until we started shooting, we had a lot of Zoom calls, a lot of hours of conversation of us trying to sort of fill in the blanks or get on the same page with what's our history, when's the last time we spoke. What was amazing too was the phone calls we had, which is when she first comes back into Solomon's life as this sort of disembodied voice of the past. I was really lucky enough to get Mari on the phone. So they had connected that office phone to a real line, and then they would call Mari. And so then right before we would go for the take, we'd pick up and just make sure like, Mari, are you on the line? Or they would actually have it calling into that line so that I would pick up the ringing phone. It would, it was incredible. But that truly was, I mean, it just helps me as an actor, but at the same time, that having those scenes first come in and just have that voice suddenly be in my life was so helpful for moving forward into like when we were in the hospital scenes and there was that reunion and all of those incredibly difficult conversations. But the process of the shooting actually helped a lot with building that, I think. And on top of that, Mari is just an incredibly lovely person, and we both live in New York, so we got to meet up, and she got to see me in Hamilton while I was still in it, actually. Which is lovely. Yeah.
Great. Well, we only have a minute left, but I did want to just congratulate you and the rest of the cast and the crew for getting that pickup for season 2. And I mean, the first season really covered a lot of fascinating ground, but I do think there's so much more story to tell just with this family. And I'm just curious if you've thought about what we might see from Solomon in the future. We assume that we'll see him again.
Yes.
I don't know how these things work, but have you thought about just where your character is headed?
I have, and also it's not really up to me.
True.
What
would you like to see happen? I guess.
Well, no, it's the same question I have in my mind. I have a meeting with the writers' room soon where I don't know what they're working on. I know Sue already has, she has the Bible of the 4 seasons in her mind already, but it's loose, and I understand she's also, obviously as an artist open to things changing, etc. But we are definitely going to see more Solomon. Something that Sue has said is we'll see more of a self-discovery, and I imagine that's going to be more of, we find Solomon from beginning of season 1 to the end of season 1 is in very different places in his life, and I think he's been thrown for a loop in terms of every assumption he's made about himself and what how the world turns has been either blown up or being questioned seriously. And the fact that he's even like, is he going to stay in Japan? I don't know, actually. I actually genuinely don't know. But what will he do if he can't work? Is he going to continue down, through the path with Yoshimamoru, or is it some sort of other reconciliation? Because, in the book, we cover about everything that happens to Solomon in the book in the first season, just about. So everything's sort of new after that. So in a way, none of us really know. But in the book, like at the end, Solomon goes to Mozasu and says, like, I want to work in the Pachinko parlor. And I don't know if that exists in our universe or not. I have no idea. But those are all sort of possibilities that are swirling around in my mind. but I'm
Well,
excited.
yeah, definitely looking forward to wherever this show goes.
Yeah.
And well, for those of you watching, subscribe for more interviews and go to goldderby.com to make your Emmy predictions. Jin, truly, thank you so much for
Thank you,
talking
Kevin.
with me today.
Appreciate it.